5 women savagely mutilated were the victims of the most notorious serial killer ever to elude police. He was known as Jack the Ripper. He was a cunning and egotistical killer with a penchant for extracting organs from his victims. He terrorized the streets of London in the fall of 1888. Who was Jack the Ripper? Why hasn't he been identified?
My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 027, The Unsolved Murders of Jack the Ripper. Our featured guest in the Midnight Hour will be Richard Jones. But first, a little cleaning of the castle. We're on Facebook still at Midnight Rider News Show, at Midnight Writer News Show. We're on Twitter at MWN_ST Patrick. We're on LinkedIn at ST Patrick. And of course, you can download our free archives at MidnightWriterNews.com. That's MidnightWriterNews.com. And I'd like to remind everyone that we're still available on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and all of your favorite podcast distributors. I want to wish everyone out there a happy Halloween. And yes, it's Halloween to the Midnight Rider News staff. It is not Harvest Day, and we aren't wishing people a happy harvest solely to eradicate the holiday of Halloween. So we'll be right back with Richard Jones. On August 31st, 1997, the world lost Diana, the Princess of Wales, in a tragic car accident in a Paris tunnel. The accident was felt worldwide, but maybe it wasn't an accident at all.
My name is Alan Power. I'm the author of The Princess Diana Conspiracy. And I was talking about, if you want to know how MI6 and the royal family were involved in the rather tragic crash that killed Diana, Princess of Wales, this is episode 21 of the Midnight Writers News Show.
As the founder of the original Aldgate East Jack the Ripper tour, Richard Jones is one of London's most experienced tour guides, and he's been conducting walks around the Whitechapel murder site since 1982. He's internationally recognized as one of the world's foremost authorities on the Jack the Ripper case, and he's the first person we contacted when we decided to do this episode. He's the author of 2 acclaimed books on the mystery, Uncovering Jack the Ripper's London and Jack the Ripper, the Casebook, the latter of which is now used as a coursework resource by schools and universities throughout the world. To see more of Richard's work, go to jacktherippertour.com and visit his YouTube page. It has some outstanding material, so I suggest it to all. But for tonight, he's with us, and we're glad to welcome him. How are you doing tonight, Richard?
Not bad at all, not bad. It's coming into the winter now, the nights are getting dark, and it's perfect Jack the Ripper weather.
Oh, it absolutely is. And we're going to take the audience back to England in 1888, and specifically to London, the largest capital in the world at this time. Richard, how would you describe Victorian England in the 1880s?
Victorian England in the 1880s was it was quite a society in many ways very like our society today, but in a lot of ways very unlike our society. You had a terrific gulf between the rich and the poor. Some might say we're going back to that today, but you had this terrific gulf between the rich and the poor. And particularly in London, this was very, very evident because London although it is a large, or is and was a large capital city, it's not that big a sprawl. So you had the situation where you had the sort of the rich and the poor constantly brushing up against each other, coming into contact with each other. And in London in particular, you had effectively the wealthiest square mile on earth, the City of London. And that's where the banks, the insurance companies were located. And yet, literally 5 minutes walk from, say, the Bank of England and the Stock Exchange, you could cross a border into the East End of London, and suddenly everything changed. You walked into one of the most poverty-stricken, crime-ridden parts of London, where the evidence of poverty was all around, and you had a populace that really did fight to survive and lived way outside the radar of the law. So it was, it was a city, say, that would be familiar to us, but a city that would be completely unfamiliar to us as well.
These murders occurred in an area of London's East End called Whitechapel. What were the environment and mood of Whitechapel in 1888?
Well, Whitechapel in 1888 was quite an interesting area. It was, it's often depicted as being the real Skid Row of the metropolis, and it did have its parts that were perhaps some of the worst slums in London. But it also had quite it had its element of, I wouldn't say actually wealthy people, but certainly reasonably well-off people, if you like, the sort of the respectable working poor and the middle classes. But you also had in Whitechapel a little area which was effectively, in fact, it was probably more Spitalfields than Whitechapel, albeit Spitalfields comes under generic of Whitechapel, but it was an area known as the Wicked Quarter Mile. And this was the area where the poor had been crammed into an ever-decreasing area. They'd started widening the roads around that area from about the 1850s onwards, and the poor had just been unhoused and just sent into sort of a smaller and smaller area. And what you had in what was known as the Wicked Quarter Mile, or the Evil Quarter Mile, were the common lodging houses. And this is where you could get a bed for fourpence, or a single bed for fourpence, a double bed for eightpence. But the men and the women and the children used to gather throughout the evening in the kitchen, and there they'd sort of cook whatever morsel they managed to beg, steal or borrow. They'd have cups of tea, and then round about midnight they'd collect the money and you'd go into these lodging houses. But in some of these lodging houses you could have anything up to 300 people. And no questions were asked about who these people were. There was no registering or anything. So they did attract a large percentage of lawlessness, or lawless people. And it was out of these people came, A, a lot of the villains of the area, but B, a lot of the prostitutes of the area, which went on to make up the sort of the main victims of Jack the Ripper.
Richard, I've heard the Whitechapel murders described as the physical embodiment of the anxieties of Whitechapel in 1888. Now, what anxieties existed that made the environment ripe for murder and suspicion?
There were a lot of anxieties at the time. For one thing, we had this massive depression. There'd been an economic downturn, and this had led to the spectre of mass unemployment, certainly in the East End of London, where people were dependent on trades such as tailoring, cabinet making, shoemaking, a whole plethora of industries. So you had that, the unemployment spectre. You'd also, from about 1881 onwards, you'd had the pogroms in Eastern Europe, which had led to a wave of immigration into the East End of London from Eastern Europe. And these were mostly low-class Ashkenazi Jews. And they settled into the area, and you got the sort of the cry going up that it coincided, unfortunately, with this economic downturn, and the cry went up that they are taking English jobs, English homes, so on and so forth. So you had a lot of that going on. But at the same time, you had all this poverty in the East End of London. And a lot of the wealthier citizens, thanks to several demonstrations that had taken place in Trafalgar Square in 1886 and 1887, 1887 is perhaps the most infamous one. These were known as the Bloody Sunday riots. But you had all the poor congregating onto the square protesting about the conditions they were being forced to live in. And so a lot of the wealthier classes were becoming very alarmed that there was going to be a revolution. And they were convinced if that revolution was going to come, the likelihood was it would come out of the East End of London. And Jack the Ripper turned up at just the right time in just that area. And what the Ripper did was, had he confined his killing spree to the Whitechapel streets, so Bucks Row, the area around Whitechapel Road, Whitechapel High Street, it probably wouldn't have impacted as much. But what he did on the 30th of September, the night of the double murder, was he crossed the boundary and he went into the city of London and murdered Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. And when that happened, in the middle class and the upper class minds, people started to think, well, if he can cross the boundary, then all these nebulous fears we have about the East End could also come over the boundary. And as a result of that, he became the personification of all that was people felt was bad about the East End, all that people feared of the East End. And as a consequence of that, he became the personification of all this. So he really did, or whoever he, maybe even she, but the murderer certainly did impact on society in a way that no serial killer had done in the past, and certainly no serial killer has done since.
Now that the stage is set, let's move to August 31st, 1888. Who is Charles Cross, and what did he find?
Charles Cross was the man who, on the 31st of August, 1888, he was on his way to work, walking along Bucks Row, and he was passing a gateway, and looking into the gateway, he saw what he what he first thought was a bundle lying on the ground. And he was actually a wagoner or a carter by trade, so he thought it would make a useful tarpaulin or cover for his wagon. So he went over to look at it, and he actually discovered it was the body of a woman. And as it transpired, it was the body of Jack the Ripper's first victim, or what many people believe was the first victim of Jack the Ripper, Mary Nichols. So Charles Cross is the man who found effectively the first victim of the killer who would go on to become known as Jack the Ripper.
Who was Mary Nichols, and in what state did Charles Cross find her?
The girl was Mary Nichols, who was the first of the Jack the Ripper's victims. At first, he wasn't certain whether she was dead or she was drunk. He just saw somebody lying in a gateway. And it's at that point a second man called Robert Paul came walking along Bucks Row, and Cross beckoned him over, and they said that there's a woman here on the ground. And they went to investigate, and they actually, one of them leant over to see if there was any sign she was breathing. They couldn't find any sign she was breathing, but as he did that, he put his hand on her chest and it moved slightly. And that's when he said to his companion, I think she's breathing, but very, very, very slightly if she is. And that's when they made a very strange decision, because they thought, well, we're late for work, and if she's dead, we really can't do anything. So they actually, her skirts had been pulled up round her waist, and they pulled the skirts down, and they went on the way saying that they would tell the first policeman they met of what they found. Interestingly enough, Charles Cross has now become one of the people who's joined the list of suspects on Jack the Ripper. But it seems to be mostly because he found that body, and a very tenuous link that they say that most of the other murders took place on his route to work. So maybe he just didn't like his job.
Yes, maybe he did not. So now that the first murder has occurred, let's introduce our audience to those who'll be investigating the crime. So Richard, who was charged with the major aspects of the investigation?
Well, the cops who did it were, mostly they were investigated by the Metropolitan Police. Now, the Metropolitan Police, their headquarters was in Whitehall, and it was in a place called Scotland Yard. So the Metropolitan Police are often referred to as Scotland Yard. And at the time, the Chief Commissioner of Scotland Yard, or the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, was Sir Charles Warren. And he was very much a military man. In fact, he really believed more in crime prevention than crime detection. And he was trying to bring a military aspect to the police at the time. And in so doing, he was getting a lot of criticism from the newspapers. He was then assisted by an assistant commissioner by the name of Dr. Robert Anderson, who was a Dublin-born lawyer. Anderson actually only came into his post on August 31st, 1888. But when Anderson arrived in his post, he'd been running or working in a secret department fighting Fenian terrorism for the government. And when he took the job as assistant commissioner in charge of the detective department of Scotland Yard, he was suffering from exhaustion. So his doctor told him he should take a recuperative break in Switzerland, or just a recuperative break, but he headed off to Switzerland. So no sooner had the murders started than the head of the detective department actually clears off and goes on a recuperative break to Scotland. But whilst he was away, or when he'd left, Charles Warren made the decision that they had to have one man in charge of overseeing the case, making sure that all the information was assessed, was read, assessed, and follow-ups done. And the man chosen for that was Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson. So they were the names who were at Scotland Yard in overall charge of the investigation: Warren, Swanson, and Anderson. But the Metropolitan Police is divided into divisions. You start with A Division, which is Scotland Yard. Then you gradually, as you work through London, It goes A, B, C. By the time you get to the East End of London, with Mary Nichols, you have J Division. And J Division were at the time, they were the ones who investigated the Mary Nichols murder. However, a lot of the murders took place in another division called H Division. And in charge of that division was one of the leading officers on that division was Inspector Edmund Reed. But very early on in the case, they decided that they needed somebody who knew the area really well. So they brought in detectives from the Detective Department of Scotland Yard, the most experienced detectives. And the one who was brought in to head up the investigation was Inspector Frederick George Aberline. And he was the one who, on the ground, took overall charge of the investigation. And he's the character, if people have seen the film From Hell, or if they've seen the Michael Caine attempts to catch Jack the Ripper, that's the character who Johnny Depp and Michael Caine play.
Now, early on, the investigators were led to a character referred to as Leather Apron. Why that moniker, and who was John Pizer?
After the murder of Mary Nichols, when Inspector Aberline came in, up until that point, the police had been following a theory that the crimes were gang-related. I mean, I said earlier that Mary Nichols was the first Jack the Ripper victim, and many say she was. The problem is that the Jack the Ripper murders come under a generic murder file, which is called the Whitechapel murders. And there's two previous victims on that file, Emma Smith in April 1888 and Martha Turner in early August 1888. Now, Emma Smith actually survived the initial attack. She died in hospital later, but she was able to tell the person who treated her, the doctor, that she'd been attacked by a gang. And there was a big gang problem in London at the time. So a lot of people were convinced very early on that the crimes were gang-related, that it was a gang running an extortion racket on the prostitutes. So that was the early belief. Now, when Aberline came in, this theory was starting to be discounted in favour of, well, they weren't certain what he was. Was he a homicidal maniac? Was he just mad? Was he mad? Was he just evil? They weren't actually certain what he was. But very early on, the prostitutes began talking to the police about a character called Leather Apron. And Leather Apron was this figure, some even think he was a mythical figure, but he was a figure who the prostitutes said would come out of nowhere in the dead of night. He would pull out a knife and he'd threaten to rip them apart if they didn't give him money. And so the police very early on got this idea they were looking for this Leather Apron. And the unfortunate thing to the police was the press got wind of who they were looking for, and they started really pushing up the Leather Apron theory. So the police were desperate to find out who Leather Apron was. And it was a police officer called Sergeant William Thick who came forward and said, well, I know who Leather Apron is. It's John Pizer. So John Pizer suddenly finds himself public enemy number one. And it seems that he was actually terrified of what might happen to him if he went out. So very early on, he went into hiding. And it was actually after the second murder of Annie Chapman that William Thick finally located him and went round to his house and arrested him. And he was taken to the police station. He was interrogated. And under police interrogation, the police could really find no evidence that he was responsible for the crimes. And everyone who knew him said he'd never been known as Leather Apron as far as they were concerned, and that he certainly wasn't the sort of person who'd carry out a murder like that. And it seems the police very quickly thought, no, we've got the wrong man there. And he was released. And in fact, he even turned up at the inquest into the murder or the death of Annie Chapman, the second victim. He turned up at that inquest where Sergeant Thick actually sat next to him, and he was publicly cleared of any involvement in the murders. But certainly this character Leather Apron was being talked about a lot. And when Annie Chapman was murdered, she was murdered between, well, probably in daylight in the very early hours of the morning. Her body was found at 6 o'clock in the morning. And when her body was found, in the corner of the yard, there was a freshly washed Leather Apron. And because the press had been talking up Leather Apron for the previous 3 days, it really did. That Leather Apron was a standard garment worn by a wide variety of Jewish tradesmen, shoemakers, bootmakers, so on and so forth. So when the press picked up on that they found this Leather Apron, they really went to town, and it did lead to anti-Semitic rioting in the neighborhood. Now, the Leather Apron, as it transpired, was nothing to do with the crime. It belonged to someone in the house. His mother had found it and washed it and then put it out to dry. So it was a complete red herring, as it were. But for about that week in early September, that nobody was using the name Leather Apron. They were using the name no one was using the name Jack the Ripper. They were using the name Leather Apron. And this is a reference that's made in the Dear Boss, the Jack the Ripper letter, where he says that, or the writer says, that joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. That's what he's referring to.
So 8 days later, September the 8th, 1888, this is the murder of Annie Chapman, the second of what is to be called the canonical five that began with Mary Nichols. Now, with Chapman, we also begin seeing a pattern by which the murders are committed. So, what did the Chapman murder tell investigators?
With Annie Chapman, you see an escalation in the physical violence and mutilation. Mary Nichols, her throat had been cut and she'd been disemboweled. Annie Chapman, the same thing had happened, but in addition, he'd actually taken, and this time he took a trophy, and that was he cut out and went off with her womb. So he's starting to take a trophy of his killing. I mean, they're both horrific killings. And the big thing that started to happen is people cannot understand the motive, because he's picking on women who've got nothing. These are women who live in common lodging houses, and the only reason both Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman had gone out in the night was to raise money to pay for a bed. So they didn't even have the fourpence to pay for a bed in the common lodging house. And so that would have ruled out robbery as a motive. As far as they could tell, there had been no sexual assault on the victim, so it wasn't for the gratification of the sexual. So as far as people were seeing, he had done it purely and simply because he enjoyed mutilating the bodies. And this was something people couldn't quite comprehend, because it was a type of crime, it was a motiveless crime as far as people could see. And this is what people are starting to see now. He's doing this, he's cutting people open, he's going off with bits of the body, and he's doing it purely for the satisfaction of the mutilation.
It was around this time that the people become very frightened, and for good reason. There was a lot of movement on the streets of Whitechapel, and the next victim could literally be anyone. So a growing dissatisfaction with police work being done leads the people to organize themselves. So how did they do so?
Yeah. What happened in early September was the newspapers started, it was a newspaper. Sir Charles Warren was very unpopular, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. He was very unpopular because of his handling of the Trafalgar Square Bloody Sunday riots the previous November. And a lot of the radical press had turned against him. In particular, the Pall Mall Gazette was constantly harping at Warren in its pages. But a lot of the other newspapers started looking at it saying, well, these murders, they're taking place in a small area. I mean, you know, they're within a few minutes walking distance of each other. So why can't the police catch this killer? And so as a consequence of that, you are starting to get people are thinking, well, why are we paying the police? And so you start to get, certainly after, it starts a bit with Mary Nichols, but it certainly escalates after Annie Chapman. There's a lot of press criticism of the police. At the same time, people are now starting to react in different ways. In the initial aftermath of the killings, you do get fear, and you do get records of people being scared to go out at night. You've also got the situation where the press have been saying to people, look, the police are useless. You've got to start policing the streets yourself. So they've actually formed several, I mean, we only think of one now, but they'd actually formed several vigilance committees. And one of the vigilance committees was the Mile End and Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which was headed up famously by Mr. George Lusk, who would later receive the From Hell letter and the kidney in the post. But so you've got these vigilance committees. Now, they're often mistaken for vigilante committees, and sometimes I know in several films they're depicted as being, you know, sort of eager mobs going out, come on, let's get him. But in fact, no, they were vigilance committees, and they were founded for several reasons. What they did, they're mostly made up of unemployed people who were then put into galoshes and raincoats, and then sent out to walk around the streets at night. And their intention was to help the police. If they actually saw anyone suspicious, they'd report it to the nearest constable. The problem was that you'd also got a lot of amateur detectives who almost saw it as a hobby. And so a lot of these amateur detectives, who in some cases were probably as mad as the Ripper was, who were patrolling the streets late at night, and suddenly they get spotted by a vigilance committee who then report them to the constable. And of course this was giving the police a massive problem, in that they were being overwhelmed by people who probably weren't Jack the Ripper, but had the potential to be Jack the Ripper, or were being suspected by these vigilance committees. And then you had the situation where you had the local people, reacting with some of them reacting with terror, but then B, reacting with fury. And we've got records, for example, with Annie Chapman of people, criminals who are being escorted by the police for completely unrelated crimes, pickpocketing or stealing from a barrel. Suddenly the mob sees someone in the hands of a police officer and they chase them, determined to lynch them. So you're having that situation happening. And then you've got the other extreme, that people are actually coming in on coach tours, or omnibus tours, to visit the murder sites. And for example, with Annie Chapman's murder, we know that the people living on either side spotted the opportunity that had been afforded to them and were renting out their windows to these sightseers so they could look down on the murder site.
Amazing. The confusion and fear, Richard. It wasn't just confined to the Whitechapel area of London's East End. Even the future famous novelist and playwright George Bernard Shaw would write a letter expressing his views on the murders.
Yeah, George Bernard Shaw was working. He was very radical, and George Bernard Shaw was working for. Well, he was writing for a newspaper called The Star, which was the principal newspaper, incidentally, that pushed the leather apron theory. It was The Star that really, in fact, some people suspected and still do suspect that there was never was a character called Leather Apron, that The Star had invented this character. But George Bernard Shaw wrote for The Star, and he wrote a very famous letter called I think it was Blood Money to Whitechapel. And in that letter, he makes the observation that for years all the radicals, all the left-wingers have been trying to draw attention to the horrible poverty in the area. And then he goes on to say that some independent genius, simply by murdering, mutilating a few women in Whitechapel, has actually managed to alert more people to the conditions in the area than any of them had ever done. And so he's the one who's starting to make the suggestion that the reason for the murders might be that Jack the Ripper is, or he's not called Jack the Ripper at the time, but the murderer is a social reformer.
And that is effective satire. But maybe George Bernard Shaw wasn't so wrong after all. I mean, these murders do illuminate the ills of the East End, do they not?
Very much so. What it did was, initially, when you get the earlier murders, you certainly get the coverage. But when Mary Nichols was murdered, what the newspapers discovered was that there was mileage in this, so you had lots of newspapers going into lots of editions, all selling out. So the journalists were flooding into the area, desperate to get stories. And what they spotted was the conditions in the area, and they started reporting on conditions, which in turn then highlighted the conditions to people who'd never been anywhere near the East End of London. And again, it had two effects. Firstly, a lot of people thought certainly with Annie Chapman, there was a lot of sympathy for her in the newspapers. And, for example, the Daily Telegraph pointed out that these two women, Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, had died for the sake of fourpence. They'd gone out to try and earn fourpence for a bed and had walked right into the hands of Jack the Ripper. So you had the newspapers reporting that element of it. And as a consequence, you get more and more people now thinking, well, we've really got to start doing something for the plight of the poor. At the same time, you've then got people like, there's a very famous Punch cartoon, which is called Nemesis and Neglect, and it shows this sort of ghoulish figure with a knife and murder on its forehead, drifting through the slums of the East End of London. And again, this is attractive, but you've just got all these journalists piling into the area, desperate for stories, and anything they can write about the East End, it suddenly makes the East End of London perhaps not the go-to place, but certainly the read-about place.
Oh, it absolutely does. Now let's move ahead around 3 weeks to September 30th, 1888. Who is Israel Schwartz, and what exactly did he see?
Israel Schwartz is he's a bit of an enigmatic figure. According to Israel Schwartz, he was walking along Berners Street a little bit. It was about quarter to 1 in the morning of the 30th of September, 1888, and there was a man slightly ahead of him, and there was a woman standing in a gateway of what we now know as Dutfield Yard. And as he watched, the man walked up to the woman and grabbed her, and there was an altercation. He then threw her onto the ground and began attacking her. Now, Israel Schwartz thought that he was witnessing a domestic argument, so he didn't want to get involved. And so he crossed over the road to avoid them. As he did so, there was another man standing under a lamp opposite who was smoking a pipe. And at that point, Schwartz was never certain who did this, but somebody uttered the word Lipsky, and the man smoking the pipe seemed to follow him. So Schwartz panicked and ran off, and the man seemed to follow him a little way, and then he stopped following. But it seems highly likely that Dupfield Yard, where he saw the attack on the woman, was where the body of Elizabeth Stride was found. Now, he was later emphatic that it was actually Elizabeth Stride he'd seen being attacked. And the fact that her body was then found at 1 a.m., so just 15 minutes later, for two such attacks to take place on the same woman in the same gateway, it's probably not possible. So consequently, what a lot of people think is that he's about the only person who actually saw the early stages of a Jack the Ripper murder. Now, that's a bit of a mystery because it then suggests that the Ripper had an accomplice, the man with the pipe. But it also seems the police did trace the man with the pipe and rule him out of the investigation. So the honest truth is, it's a case that we have so many of these things in the Ripper investigation, where we get these tantalizing things happen where you think, oh, we're onto something here. And then they just fizzle out, and you just lose them. But say Schwartz, if what he said he saw was true, then Schwartz probably did see the Ripper attacking a victim. And then again we come to this problem: was Elizabeth Stride a victim of the Jack the Ripper, though? Because her injuries weren't consistent with the other victims. So a lot of people think that it was a coincidence, not an actual part of the same set of serial killers. It was just that he happened to see it, and it might have been a domestic argument. The term Lipsky, incidentally, was a reference to Israel Lipsky, who was a Jewish immigrant who'd murdered one street down from there. You had Batty Street, and he'd carried out the Batty Street murder. He'd been executed the previous year. And the term Lipsky was often used by Gentiles as a term, an insult towards the Jewish population in the area as a result of that.
How are the injuries of Elizabeth Stride not consistent with the other victims?
Her injuries weren't part of the pattern. Her throat, only her throat had been cut. So her throat had been cut, which was consistent with the other victims, but the rest of the body hadn't been touched. Now, the interesting thing about it is that at 1 o'clock in the morning, when the body was discovered, she was discovered by a man named Louis Diemschutz. And Diemschutz, at 1 o'clock, pulled his cart into that yard. And as he did so, the horse shied and pulled to the left. Now, Diemschutz leaned forward to see what was disturbing it and saw something on the ground. So he prodded it with his horsewhip, couldn't move it. So he jumped down and struck a match and saw it was a woman lying on the ground. And so he discovered the body of Elizabeth Stride. Now, what the police thought had happened, and a lot of people think happened, was that as Diemschutz came into that yard, he disturbed the killer before he could carry out the other mutilations. Some say no, that it was just a complete coincidence, but I personally do think that he did disturb the Ripper, and I think it's quite a spooky thought that Diemschutz probably, when he was first in that yard, when he first went in and he was jumping down looking at the body, the Ripper was probably standing very close by him and he just didn't notice him in the dark.
Oh yes, that absolutely could have been the case. And if that is the case, then the Whitechapel murderer was about to have an active evening. Because that same night, well, Joseph Lewenda sees something also. So Richard, take us behind the eyes of Joseph Lewenda.
Yeah, Lewenda was one of a group of three men who'd left a club on Duke's Place in the city of London. And the three of them were walking past an entrance into Mitre Square, which is on the city's eastern fringe. And as they walked past, they saw a man and a woman chatting. Now, two of them were disgusted to see these two, a man and a woman, out at that time of the morning. So they crossed over the road in disgust to avoid them. But Joseph Lewenda kept walking, and he was close enough to take in a little bit. Now, what he saw, he didn't see the woman's face because she had her back to him, but when he was shown Catherine Eddowes' clothing in the mortuary later, he said that was the clothing the woman was wearing. He did see the man's face, interesting enough, so he was able to give a rough description of the man. About 5'6", fresh complexion, moustache, so on. So he did get a glimpse of the man, but he was always emphatic after that it was a very brief glimpse, and that if he saw the man again, he wouldn't be able to recognize him. And I personally think he's probably right on that, because it was just the early hours of the morning. He was walking past, took a look, and carried on. And it was only, obviously, going back with hindsight, that he started to think about what he'd seen when he knew there'd been a murder. But yeah, Joseph Lewenda probably saw Catherine Eddowes in the company of a murderer.
Now, just to make this clear, the injuries of Catherine Eddowes were consistent with the pattern. Is that correct?
Yeah, her injuries were both part of the pattern and an escalation in the pattern as well. Again, her throat had been cut, but this time the killer had targeted the face, which he hadn't done with the previous victims. He cut deep V's into the cheeks, V's into the eyelids. He took off the tip of the nose, nicked the ears. He'd also cut her open. This time he'd gone off with the uterus and the left kidney as well.
As far as the Whitechapel murders are concerned, October of 1888 was a violence-free month. There were no victims. Now, I understand that we can only speculate, but why do you think the murder, after committing 2 on the same evening, went another month before striking again?
Now that's the question ripperologists have been asking for so long. It's an almost impossible question to answer, simply because we don't know who Jack the Ripper was. Some say it was because he might have been out of London, which would suggest he could have been a sailor on a ship. That he might have left London on a ship. He could have been somebody in business who'd gone away for a few weeks or whatever. My personal belief is because with the murder of that night of the double murder, there was a massive increase in police activity in the area, and people were now on the lookout for him. There was a lot more, you had lots of police, and you didn't just have uniformed police officers as well. You had plainclothes police who were going around in all sorts of disguises. There's one story, some of them were even dressed up as prostitutes to try and lure him out. So you've got a lot more police activity in the area, and my personal belief is it was just too dangerous for him, that he was just he might well have gone out looking for a victim, and he just couldn't do it. He just couldn't do a victim. He couldn't get a victim simply because there were so many police in the area, and the police, because of all the criticism they were getting, were really on high alert now to catch him. So I personally think it was the police activity that stopped him murdering through October. However, what's interesting is it's in October that we have the birth of Jack the Ripper.
Yes.
Because the police had come under so much criticism prior to and after the double murder, that they decided to try and get some more information. So this is when they released the letter that had been sent to the head of the Central News Office in New Bridge Street in the City of London. And this is the famous letter that is the "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me." And that's the letter that is signed Jack the Ripper. And so in October, you've suddenly got this name Jack the Ripper has cropped up. And it was released to the public. It was put out. It was put up on posters. It was put in newspapers, and the important thing is it caught on. And what it did was it sparked off a whole wave of imitations, and so the police were suddenly inundated with letters coming in from people purporting to be Jack the Ripper or the Whitechapel murderer, and every one of these letters had to be investigated. So although there were no murders throughout October, the police were certainly kept incredibly busy, largely as a result of releasing the Jack the Ripper letter.
Yes, now I can imagine. So on that last night, I forgot to ask you, Sir Charles Warren makes an interesting choice regarding some writing that he had found on the wall. Now, this was the night of the 2 murders. What happened?
Yeah, what had happened was when Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square, the city, because the point about Catherine Eddowes' murder is that she was murdered in the City of London. Now, the City of London has its own police force, so all the murders were investigated by the Metropolitan Police of Scotland Yard, with the exception of Catherine Eddowes, because she was murdered in the City of London, and the City of London have and had their own police force. So when she's murdered, the city police were very quickly on the scene. I mean, within moments, they were on the scene. And suddenly, you've got this murder's taken place. Her body's probably discovered within minutes of him carrying out the crime and then escaping from Mitre Square. So the city police go off into the streets to try and find him. And nothing comes of it. But then, at round about 2:55 in the morning, PC Alfred Long was walking along Goulston Street. Now, just to give you an idea where Goulston Street is, it's about 3 or 4 blocks over from Mitre Square. So it's going east from the City of London. So it's back in Metropolitan Police territory. And an officer called Alfred Long was going along Goulston Street, and in a doorway he found a piece of blood-stained apron. And it was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron from Mitre Square. There was no doubt about it, because they took it to the mortuary and they matched it, and it fitted perfectly onto the apron. So this is the clue that Jack the Ripper left behind. But Long then searched the doorway to see if he could see anything else. And on the door jamb, it wasn't massive big writing, but there was a line that read, "The dues of the men that will not be blamed for nothing." And straight away, that became a hot potato, simply because although it's on Metropolitan Police territory, it pertains to an investigation being carried out by the city police. And the city police suddenly crossed over the boundary and came into the East End of London, where they clashed with the Metropolitan Police. Now, because they'd had the anti-Semitic rioting, the Metropolitan Police were terrified that if that was still on the wall come the dawn, you're going to have a big market round there called the Petticoat Lane Market, and thousands of Gentiles would be flocking into the market. And what the Metropolitan Police thought was, if they see that, we'll have complete eruption of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rioting on the streets. So they were anxious to rub it out. But the city police said, no, we want to photograph it. Now, photographing would mean you had to wait till it got light, by which time the people would be start arriving in the area. So the argument was going full pelt at 5:30 in the morning when Sir Charles Warren arrived at the scene. And he's the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. This is on his territory. Warren took one look at it and said, no, I don't want that there. And he ordered it to be erased before any photograph could be taken. And it was probably one of the most controversial orders he gave. Major Henry Smith of the City Police, for example, considered he'd made a major blunder in doing that. Fairness to Warren, those who saw it said it looked faded, as though it had been there for some time. Personally, I think it was a complete coincidence. If it had been in a different doorway, the connection wouldn't have been made, but because it was found where that apron was found, the connection was made. I think it's a red herring, but as I say, Warren came under massive amounts of criticism for erasing the message.
So we come to November 9th, 1888. Now, there's been no violence for over a month, but a 25-year-old woman is wandering the streets, which I'm sure to many begs the question, why? But this woman is apparently asking for money. Who is she and what happened?
Well, she's Mary Kelly. And it wasn't actually, I mean, to be honest, we thanks largely to films, we get this impression or this image of the streets being deserted by night and these women walking through the streets and the ripple lurking in the shadows. But in fact, the streets of Whitechapel are massively busy at night. You had lots of people walking around all night. You had markets in the area. You had slaughterhouses in the area. Some of the pubs were still open in the area. So the busy thoroughfares could be quite busy. Now, Mary Kelly lived. Interesting thing about Mary Kelly is she had her own room. She lived in Miller's Court, which was just off Dorset Street, but she was actually behind with her rent. She owed 29 shillings in rent arrears, and she'd gone out on the morning of the 9th of November 1888, and she met a man named George Hutchinson, and she said to him, "Hutchinson, lend us a tanner," which was sixpence. He said no, he'd spent out at Romford Market, and her response was, well, I'll just have to find it some other way, won't I? And she went walking along, and Hutchinson noticed a man coming from the other direction, and the man tapped her on the shoulder. She turned, looked at him. Some words were exchanged, and then they started laughing, and she took his hand, put it around her waist, and led him to Dorset Street. Now, Hutchinson, strangely, follows them. And in fact, at one stage, he said that as the man walked past him, and he tried to look under his hat, and the man sort of tried to hide his face from him. But he followed them to Miller's Court. Miller's Court had an archway and went through the court, but he waited on the opposite side of Dorset Street from Miller's Court for 45 minutes. Now, we don't know why. That's never been explained why he did that. Some say that he was perhaps Mary Kelly. Well, it was called a bully in those days, but what was known as a pimp, that he was Mary Kelly's pimp, and that he was actually, his intention was to rob the man when he came out, and he couldn't admit that. But we honestly don't know why, but he waited for 45 minutes, said nothing happened, so he went home to bed. And then a few days later, he heard that Mary Kelly had been murdered.
How was she murdered, Richard? What happened that night in that room?
That it was the most horrible of all the killings. She'd not only been ripped open twice, but she'd been virtually skinned down to the bone. And it's one of them. She was the only victim who was photographed at the scene of the crime, and I'm sure you've seen the photograph. It's on the internet if people want to, but it really is. You look at that photograph. At first, it takes a lot of realization that you're looking at the remains of a human being there. It was such a gruesome, horrible killing, and some say that it was a different modus operandi. So it wasn't the Jack the Ripper crime. It was some other crime. Personally, again, I think it was the escalation of the violence. I also think it was because he had time now. With all the other murders, he's outdoors. Anybody could come walking past, but now he's indoors and he's got plenty of time. But it was a revolting killing, And I think it was best summed up by her landlord, John McCarthy, who later that day said to a journalist, "I'd heard much of the Whitechapel murders, but I never expected I'd see a sight like this. I hope I may never see such a sight again. It looked more like the work of a devil than the work of a man."
Wow. Now, speaking of the injuries and the escalation thereof, I had heard or I had read that it was also an escalation of the weapon in a sense that he didn't only use a knife this time. Is that correct?
This is a difficult one. Some do say that an axe was used. As far as I know, there's no record of an axe being used. There might have been several different types of knife used. Might have been one. But the honest truth is, a lot of the talk about other things being used on her body, a lot of that talk is talk that people have come to later on and sort of thought, well, looked at the photograph and thought, well, this must have been done some other way. So, as I say, yeah, there are some who say that an axe was used on her body. Personally, I don't hold with it, and there's the contemporary documents, the newspaper reports, don't talk about it.
The reactions to the Kelly murder are fascinating in that both the police and the people seemingly do a 180 regarding where they'd been before. Now, the police offer this strange pardon as the people almost become disinterested, perhaps maybe suffering some murder fatigue.
It is, yeah. What happened? There was one of the big things that was going on, because obviously with so many things like this, you've got the story as we know it, but there's a lot of things going on in the background. And one of the big things that was being argued over from the very start was should a reward be offered. And at the time, it was the Home Office that was refusing to offer a reward, because their attitude was, if you offer a reward in a poor area, people are going to come forward and give false information just because they want to get a reward. So that was the Home Office official policy, and they stuck to it throughout. Now, they got lots of criticism for this. In fact, it was actually Sir Charles Warren who got a lot of the criticism over not offering a reward. In fairness to Warren, it wasn't him. It was the Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, who said, no, we're just not going to give her a reward. And there's lots of newspaper accounts. And this was one of the things the Vigilance Committee did. They were petitioning to get a reward offered. And a lot of points are being made, like the Pall Mall Gazette, for example, made an observation in October that if these murders had taken place in the West End, if the victims had been duchesses, then a reward would have been offered. It was effectively saying they don't care about these women because they're poor women from the East End of London. Now, what then happened was that on the night of the double murder, because Catherine Eddowes was murdered in the City of London, the Lord Mayor of the City of London did offer a reward, and also several newspapers, most notably the Illustrated Police News, also offered a reward for information, and then a local MP also offered a reward, saying that for information that might lead to the apprehension of the killer. Now, what Sir Charles Warren did after Mary Nichols' murder was he, again, couldn't offer a reward because he was beholden to the Home Office, which the City of London Police hadn't been. But what he did do was offer a free pardon to anybody who can give any information if they're an accomplice. That's the important thing. He's not going to give a pardon to the killer, but if there's an accomplice who knows who the killer is and has shielded him, they'll be given a pardon if they give the information. And it is interesting, actually, to note that the Home Office might have been correct in this, because we know, I mean, I think it's after Catherine Eddowes' murder, the reward's up to £1,200, and yet no information was given that led to the apprehension. So it seems that the reward wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever. But what happens after Mary Kelly's murder is, firstly, unlike the other murders, the inquest is done very quickly. It's over in a day. The other murders were presided over, or quite a few of them were presided over by the coroner, Wynne Baxter, and he made the inquest his sounding board, and he dragged them out. So they lasted several weeks, and this gave the newspapers the opportunity to keep reporting on the horrors and the revelations. I mean, you look at the headlines, new revelations, horrible mutilations. Mary Kelly, they don't do that. They very quickly have the inquest, and it's over. And this means the press can't report as much on what's going on. And so it's almost as though someone's just switched off. Someone's just pulled the plug on the whole thing, because the press, just after the murder of Mary Kelly, the press speculation, the press sensationalizing it dies down very quickly, and the people just get back to their everyday lives, and it's as though they've almost become inured to the violence and elements. It's also probable as well that people had started to realise that he was only a danger to a certain portion, a certain area of society, and a certain class of women in that particular area as well.
Yes, and I've seen this before. When so many bad, horrible things happen back to back to back to back, it seems like the people do become sort of fatigued by the story.
Very much so. And also, of course, the other thing is that we're because of that gap throughout October, and the newspapers have started drumming up the Jack the Ripper story, so he's got that name, Jack the Ripper. It almost turns it into a pantomime. You're getting hawkers selling the stories around the streets. You're getting fruit and veg. You're getting waxworks in the area are putting on shows which are showing the mutilations on the bodies. So almost like a carnival-like atmosphere is coming on, and you're also getting records of police saying to the women who they find out on the streets in the Allows, there's a murderer loose, and they're going, what do I care? It's the river or him for me. So it's almost like people have become blasé about it by November. That the initial fear, the panic, people would start to accept it.
As we mentioned before, this was Victorian-era England. Now, the namesake of that era, Queen Victoria, who was the monarch of England from 1837 to 1901, she became very interested in this case. How did she involve herself?
Queen Victoria was involved quite a lot throughout. She was involved in that the Vigilance Committee, when the Home Office wouldn't offer a reward, the Vigilance Committee actually went direct to the Queen, and they petitioned her saying, "Look, can you instruct your mandarins in the Home Office to start offering a reward?" What she then did was she actually telegraphed the Home Office later on, saying, She wasn't as involved as it's often made out she was. She took an interest in the police inability to catch the killer. But one of the things she did highlight was she said, one point was she said, all these streets must be lit. I mean, one of the big things that came out of the press coverage was that you had all these dark, narrow passageways where there was no light at night, which was the perfect place to carry out the murders and then just disappear into the alleyways. But the other interesting thing she said in a telegraph was that our detectives or our police force must be improved. They are not what they should be. In other words, so she was very critical of the police's inability to catch the Ripper.
As you discussed earlier, Richard, there seems to be an ongoing debate among Ripperologists regarding how many murders Jack actually committed. So what's your opinion on this? How many murders?
This is almost the impossible question, because I have to say, honest truth is, I don't know. It's generally agreed that there were 5 Jack the Ripper victims: Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. However, those are the Jack the Ripper murders. As I said earlier, the Jack the Ripper murders come under a generic file called the Whitechapel murders, and there are 11 victims on the Whitechapel murders file. 2 of them took place before Mary Nichols' murder, and several of them took place. Alice Mackenzie, for example, was July 1889. You also get the Rose Milet, who was found dead in Poplar in December 1888. There's the Pinchin Street torso, which is there. And then the last one is February 1891, when you have the murder of Francis Coles. I would say, I would err on the side of caution. I would say, for an exact number, it could be as few as 4. It might be as many as 8.
Okay, Richard, so we're going to mark you down for somewhere between 4 and 8. So the murders end here. Now, I'm going to ask you the impossible why question again, but I also want to know what you think that tells us about the murder that they do end here.
If they did stop, as I say, because if the reason we have this cozy concept of the canonical 5 that I mentioned earlier is because of a man named Melville Macnaghten, who compiled a report in the 1890s in which he talks about, he says emphatically, the Whitechapel murder had 5 victims and 5 victims only. Now, he actually had his own suspect, who was Montague John Druitt, who committed suicide at the end of November. Now, if the later murders were by Jack the Ripper, then that would rule Druitt out as a suspect, and he was emphatic, he was convinced Druitt was the Ripper. So it's because of what Macnaghten says that we have this idea of the canonical 5, the 5 victims and 5 victims only. However, some might say that certainly Alice Mackenzie might have been a victim. hint that her throat had been cut. Even Francis Coles had had a throat cut. So we've got these five. I say that this nice sort of cozy image of the five victims. But if he did stop, he stopped for a reason. Now that reason, there could have been several reasons, but one could have been that he died. That shortly after the last murder, he died. Another one could have been that his family or somebody incarcerated in a lunatic asylum because they realized who he was and they put him into a private asylum, and that's why the murders ceased. Another possibility is that he was arrested for an unrelated crime, went to prison, and they didn't realize who they'd got. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that he went somewhere else and continued murdering and they never made the connection. That's very unlikely because they were reported all over the world and they most certainly would have made the connection. Of course, the other possibility is that the police did catch him and that they knew who he was, but for reasons best known to themselves, they decided to keep it quiet and just put him off to an asylum. And this is where we come into the suspect named Aaron Kosminski.
Well, it seems like a good time to start our discussion of suspects, and let's go ahead and start with Aaron Kosminski. Who was Aaron Kosminski, and why is he a suspect?
Kosminski seems to have been, and again I have to stress, seems to have been the favoured suspect of the two highest-ranking officers on the case, Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Swanson. Anderson, in his memoirs, The Lighter Side of My Official Life, talks about the killer, where he says effectively undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the crimes known as the Jack the Ripper murders do not fall into this category. In stating he was a low-born Polish Jew living in the heart of the area, I am stating the ascertained fact. And when the one person who ever gained a clear view of the face of the murderer was confronted with our suspect, he unhesitatingly identified him but refused to testify. So Anderson says that they had him, but the one person... Now, that's the problem. We don't know who the one person he's talking about was. It's either Lavender or Israel Swartz. But he says there was an identification, but the witness wouldn't testify. Now, Anderson gave a copy of his memoirs to Swanson, and Swanson's copy turned up later. And in the margin, Swanson had actually penciled the name Kosminski. And in the records, there's only one Kosminski who fits the bill. He goes into the asylum he's actually picked up by the police. He goes into the asylum in 1891. He goes into Colney Hatch Asylum, and he's then transferred to Leiston Asylum and dies in 1919. Now, he's a difficult one because his asylum records have not been opened yet. They don't open because of the 100-year rule. They don't open until 2019. So that's when his records will be opened. But all the evidence we have of him in the asylum suggests that he just doesn't seem to have been homicidal. In fact, one of the very few acts of aggression that we know he performed was he threw a chair at an attendant, which is hardly sort of a homicidal maniac behaviour. But he's interested because Anderson and Swanson, they certainly seem to have both thought that he was the Ripper. If that's the case, they were in the position to know all the evidence against all the suspects. So if they thought he was the murderer, there must have been a reason.
Are there still researchers who consider John Pizer, Israel Swartz, or Joseph Lavenda part of the suspect list?
There are. I mean, the point about the Ripper is because he was never caught, you can almost point the finger at anybody and build a case and say, well, that was Ripper. So yeah, I mean, I would say that they probably aren't. They're just people who found themselves drawn into the investigation because they happen to be, depending on how you look at it, in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time. But these are just people who just happen to come across something that puts them into the frame. And this happens so many times.
Now, in my reading, Richard, I found an interesting story about a Dr. Thomas Neal Cream.
Dr. Cream. Dr. Cream's interesting. Again, he doesn't seem to fit. He was a poisoner. He poisoned his victims. And you're talking about a different modus operandi here. Someone like Jack the Ripper is more, I don't even know what the word for it would be, is more hands-on in the aggression, whereas a poisoner tends to be more withdrawn from it. Cream's interesting there because he was actually executed, and when he went to the gallows, his last words reputedly on the gallows was the effect of, "Wait, I'm Jack the," and then the trap fell and killed him. So he never he never finished the sentence. And there's a lot of talk. Was he going to say I'm Jack the Ripper? But he probably wasn't. He might have been going to say it, but it might have just been that he wanted to buy a bit more time or something.
Oh yes, absolutely. I can understand wanting to buy some time. Now, what about David Cohen?
David Cohen. David Cohen's quite a complex theory. David Cohen was a Martin Fido find, and basically it's almost it's very difficult to explain. What Martin Fido suspects is that David Cohen might have been a suspect who had a different name, who went into the asylum, and that what Martin discovered was that a lot of the times if the attendants couldn't pronounce the name, it's like a John Doe name, they'd simply use the name Cohen if they were Jewish immigrants. Probably now he's not one of the more likely suspects, to be honest.
Okay, now we're going to go to the 3 emails from listeners, and one has to do with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, he has a real twist on the case. What was his idea?
Conan Doyle's belief was that to escape, because one of the big things that mystified people was how he could commit these crimes and disappear without being noticed, and all sorts of theories that done the rounds. But Conan Doyle's theory was that he got away because, having committed the murders, he dressed up as a woman and was able to go off dressed as a woman, and that way people weren't looking for a woman, so that's how he was able to get through the crowds. And B, by putting the dresses on, he was able to hide the bloodstains. So Conan Doyle believed that he dressed as a woman.
Yes, that is a fascinating theory by Doyle. I'm not so sure that that's going to end up being accurate, but it's a fascinating theory nonetheless. Now, the next emailer wants to know about the work of Patricia Cornwell on the Jack the Ripper case. They want to know what your views are on her work and her ideas.
Patricia Cornwell favours the artist Walter Sickert. So you have to take your hat off to her. She's done an awful lot of research, a lot of stuff. One of the things, she's one of the people who depended on doing DNA analysis and forensic analysis, which is problematic in itself, given the passage of time and given how many times things have been handled. I would say, in my opinion, she hasn't produced a convincing case that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. She's produced, in my opinion, a case that he might have written some of the letters that were attributed to Jack the Ripper, but not many serious historians believe that the letters were written by the murderer. And in fact, so many of the letters were by so many different people, because it became almost a pastime in October 1888 and beyond, writing letters signed Jack the Ripper or whatever. So she's certainly done a great deal of work. She's certainly regenerated interest in it. Has she closed the case, which is what it's a Jack the Ripper case closed? I would say probably not.
Probably not. You're right. Now, the most popular question that we received is email number 3. Do you think there's any chance that Jack the Ripper had any royal ties?
There's always potential. It's one as a Jack the Ripper tour guide. It's the question I get asked probably more than any other. Ooh, was it a member of the royal family? We know it's a member. The member of the royal family in question is Prince Albert Edward Victor. Albert Edward Victor died in the flu epidemic in the 1890s. Now, the theory is that he didn't really die of flu, that he had syphilis, and the syphilis had turned his mind and sent him on the rampage, murdering prostitutes. In honesty, he almost certainly died of flu. As for being Jack the Ripper, we know, because of the court circulars, we know his movements on the nights of all the murders. He wasn't in London on the nights of several of the murders. In fact, on the night of double murder, he was actually at Balmoral in Scotland. And even today, you'd be hard pushed to sort of come down from Balmoral overnight, commit murders, and then get back for breakfast the next morning. Even with today's modes of transport, that would be difficult. In 1888, it would have been almost impossible. So no. But people always like a conspiracy theory, and so consequently, the royal Ripper will just keep going and going.
Yes, it absolutely will. Now, regarding occupation, is there any chance that Jack the Ripper was either a cop or a doctor?
The cop or the police officer is an interesting one. Several newspapers at the time were suggesting he might be a police officer because a police officer would obviously know the layout, know where the police were, and be able to avoid the police lines. Personally, I think if he was a police officer, he would have been spotted by the other officers. I think that certainly after the double murder, they were so on the lookout. I don't think he would have got away with it. As for was he a doctor, this is something that's been argued about ever since. I.e., do the murders demonstrate medical knowledge? And then when you come to the medical knowledge, you have to sort of say, well, what sort of knowledge do they demonstrate? Now, you've got to say some doctors who examined the bodies at the time said that he demonstrated anatomical knowledge. That is, that he knew where the organs were in order to remove them, be able to dissect them. Others said he had surgical knowledge in that he was able to know how to remove them. And then other doctors said, no, he's just demonstrating knowledge of a slaughterman. So it's a difficult one to say because the jury was out at the time, the jury's out today. And he might have had basic medical knowledge. He might have had the knowledge of a slaughterman. Certainly the way that he was certainly somebody who was, he certainly had experience of cutting bodies up, but whether they're in butchery or surgery, we just don't know.
Now, I can't end the interview tonight, Richard, if I don't ask you personally for your opinion. Who do you think was Jack the Ripper?
I personally think that we'll never know. My personal opinion is it was somebody who lived in the area and somebody who everybody thought was a little bit eccentric, a little bit odd, but perfectly harmless. And every so often the voices in his head got a bit too much and he would go out and he'd commit these murders. Of the suspects that have been named over the years, you read them, you think, well, that's interesting and that's interesting. I think one person who really should be looked at a lot more than he has been is a man called Thomas Cutbush, who was...
and who is he?
Cutbush was arrested round about the same time as Kosminski went into the asylum, and he was actually taken on. He stabbed several women in the bottom in South London. Now he was actually found to be insane, and he was sent to an asylum. In fact, he was sent to Broadmoor Asylum. Now his papers did become available in 2008. And on his asylum records, he is most certainly homicidal. He threatens to rip people up. He's paranoid. On one occasion, his mother goes to visit him. She goes to kiss him goodbye, and he bit her face. So he certainly was a very violent person. What's interesting about him is that he was the nephew of Superintendent Cutbush of Scotland Yard, and it was because of it was a newspaper in 1894 called The True Sun that named. They didn't actually name him, but all the information they published about, we know who Jack the Ripper is, we've been to see him in the asylum, all the information suggested Cutbush. And it seemed to have been that I remember I mentioned earlier that Melville Macnaghten did his report where he talks about the canonical five and he favours Druitt. It was the Cutbush stories in the papers at the time that led Macnaghten to prepare the report that established the concept of the canonical five. So I think Cutbush is someone who certainly does deserve more looking at than he has been, but the problem with him is that he's not a painter, he's not a member of the royal family. He is effectively an ordinary person, but I think sadly that's what Jack the Ripper was. He wasn't an exciting person. He was a sad to quote Donald Trump, pathetic person who basically the voice got to it. So I think Cutbush might be interesting, but I think personally we'll never know his true identity. But if we ever do, and it's named, they say stand up Jack the Ripper, everyone will turn around and go, well, who's that?
Yes, you're probably right. Now, I ask this of all the guests, so if listeners want to go to a bookstore or a library and seek more information, what are the 3 works that they should absolutely read?
I would say, well, first of all, wouldn't I? I'd say my book Uncovering Jack the Ripper's London, because it does look at the area. But I would say Paul Begg's The Definitive Jack the Ripper. I think that is an excellent tome. I would also say Philip Sugden's The Complete History of Jack the Ripper. I think it's the complete history, but it's the book by Philip Sugden anyway. And I would say when you're going through them, have alongside you the A to Z of the A to Z of Jack the Ripper by Paul Begg, Martin Fido, and Keith Skinner.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Now, Richard Jones, you're doing maybe the definitive Jack the Ripper tour in London.
I do.
Tell us a little bit about that.
The tour takes place every night. We go at 7 o'clock from Aldgate East Underground Station, and we venture into we do it as chronologically as it's possible to do. Well, we start where the attack on Emma Smith took place in April 1888. She's the first Whitechapel murders victim. Then we go into this wonderful old arch that takes us into what's now called Gunthorpe Street, but in 1888 was George Yard. And this is where Martha Tabram, or Martha Turner as she was also known, she was murdered here in August 1888. And a lot of people think she may well have been the first Jack the Ripper victim before he developed his modus operandi. And that then leads us into this wonderful knot of streets that have hardly changed since 1888. They're lined, 18th century houses, which were the backcloth against which the Ripper murders took place. And we really do immerse people in the story of the crimes. But also we try and get people to understand the plight of the victims, because in many ways, the Ripper story is a sad story. It's a story of 5 women who they died simply because they all of them had in common they were alcoholics. All of them in common they'd slipped through the net of society, and there was just nothing to catch them. There was no safety net in those days, and they just slipped through the net, ended up on the streets of the East End of London, and as a result became the victims of Jack the Ripper. And I think from that perspective, it's a lesson in history, and that's what we try to make it. That let's, no matter what's happening, no matter where the world's going, let's not go back to that age.
Well, it sounds great, and you can count me in whenever I venture across the pond.
You'd be very welcome.
And thank you for that. Now, for anyone who would like to follow you, find out more about the Jack the Ripper tour, or find out more about Jack the Ripper in general, how can they find you?
They can go to my website, which is rippertour.com. So it's rippertour.com, all one word, rippertour.com. And I've got a daily blog that goes out, which I produce every day. Every other day, sorry. I do a blog of the newspapers from that day, what the stories were on that day. I do stories about the police investigation. And they can also watch videos as well.
And this has been Ripperologist Richard Jones from rippertour.com. Richard, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. You were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good night. I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. On episode 16 of the Midnight Rider News Show, we discuss the fate of the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, with Steve Eubaney, Jason Myers, and Cynthia Hall. Was Elvis murdered, or is he still alive? For more, download episode 16 of the Midnight Rider News Show today.
We can't go on together with suspicious minds.
Episode 024, as some of you have so perceptively noticed, is not on the site. No, we did not mistakenly skip the episode, and no, it's not hidden. Episode 024 has become a lost episode of sorts. But what was once lost will soon be found. Episode 024 was to be our episode on the early conspiracies regarding the shootings in Las Vegas. And our guest, Midnight Rider News' own Brian Lloyd, was on the story from the moment it happened. However, he didn't feel comfortable enough to do the episode with what information had been available to him. So I just spoke to him today, and yes, he's ready. So, though it's a bit out of order, we will have the show on MidnightRiderNews.com within the week. And believe me, you will be glad you waited. What Brian has planned for you is outstanding. If you thought you knew what happened in Las Vegas, think again. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.